as open as we can. And please let me know if I'm overstepping my bounds. I'm sure one or all of you will. But I want this to be open. I just want to try to facilitate a discussion here. I don't want to in any way direct this process. Melanie, welcome. You're on mute.
And I just have one request. I just need a
Yes.
volunteer to do minutes. And they can
Do
be
we-
very basic minutes.
I guess I'd rather not be that person, but Melanie, did you just volunteer?
Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you.
All
Thank
right.
you.
So it's 1:02 p.m. on February 4th, 2021. This is the first meeting of the Lewis Planning Commission Subcommittee on Annexation. We have been given the opportunity by the City Council, and I think I'm going to let Janelle go through the details on that, but to sort of review what's been done so far with the AX mix and AX res zones in our code. Because there are a lot of related pieces, I'm hoping that we will be able to sort of sort out the web of interrelationships of the various pieces of code that I think are most relevant to a discussion of AX res and AX mix. With that, Janelle, I think I'm going to ask for the overview.
Sure. So I'm just going to give everyone a basic background of annexation process. Again, this subcommittee is just to focus on the annexation zones, which is the AX res and the AX mix. But just to kind of give some perspective, Delaware is unique in one of the states is there's room to grow. Not every state has room to grow. And again, some of this is for the public because we have 4 people listening. So we have the ability to expand the city boundaries. That process is identified through the charter, and that happens whether or not to accept an annexation and what the property is going to be zoned all goes through mayor and city council. They handle that entire process. They get a request, it goes to a committee of the council members. They take a look at it and determine whether or not it could be detrimental or a positive or neutral for the application for the property to come into the city. They will also at that time kind of look at what zoning classification makes the best sense for that property. And this is where the comp plan comes in. The comp plan identifies annexation areas for the city of Lewis. And for that, then we have a tendency to put kind of just a generic land use overlay on top of that, which is residential, which means it should come in as a residential, or in other places it's classified as mixed, which means it could come in as a multitude of different zoning classifications. When an application comes in, there's no limit as to what zoning classification can be applied to that property. So if, say, my property comes in and I'm right on the edge and I want to come in as commercial, I can request that zoning classification. I am not tied to the AX res or the AX mix. The reason these 2 zoning classifications were created is because the city recognized the pressure of development coming from the county, and it was coming down Savannah and it's coming down New Road. And the city wanted to look at like, okay, well, how do we, because the city has no land use control over properties outside the city. And how do we entice properties to want to come in and to annex into the city? Because we are the ones who have the utilities through BPW, have the water and the sewer and the electric. So how do we try to entice them to come in? So a group was put together, 2018 timeframe, maybe even a little bit before, to
Actually,
look at.
The first round of conversations, I think, started in middle of 2016 and went well into 2017, and I think there was a bit of a pause.
Yeah, so a committee was gotten together. I believe there was members of the public, members of council, different groups gotten together to take a look at like how to try to have more of that control over the land use. How do we encourage people to annex into the city? So they came up with two zoning classifications, the AX Res, which is a residential zoning, which a bunch of different options, and the AX Mix, which allows for a mixture of commercial and residential uses. That went before the Planning Commission. Planning Commission met, had public comment, made a recommendation to council. Council then held a meeting, made their own recommendations, changed a few things here and there, which they're allowed to do based on any recommendation, and then adopted the ordinance. What council has asked this group and the planning commission to do is take a look at the ordinances. You know, are there any, again, I think they've been used once. The AX Res has only been used once. The AX Mix has not been used at this time. Are there any issues with the zoning districts? Do we like them? Do we not like them? Are there any changes? And just to have a discussion about them. I'm going to put this out there. You don't have to change anything if you don't want to. If you want to change it all, you can. If you just want to make tweaks here and there, that's up to you. These are looking at all of these items, and then to make that recommendation to the commission. Commission then will make a recommendation to council, and council has the final authority on whether to accept or to make changes to any recommendation. And as with all the subcommittees, there's a webpage for this subcommittee. I have put on a link to the AX Res zoning district, the AX Mix Res zoning district, the dimensional requirements for those, so everybody has an idea of what we're looking for, and kind of some history about the council minutes, the planning commission minutes as to when this was discussed and what was discussed at those meetings. And in one of those mayor and council items was actually the report from that annexation committee that was a group of council and members of the public. And I'm going to turn it back over to Sumner unless you guys have any more questions or any questions.
Yeah, I have a couple questions. I think several of us were on the call at 11 o'clock, the Zoom meeting. When a property is annexed and it's not coming in as AX Res or AX Mix, but it's going to be zoned using one of our, using another zoning category. Does that mean that does that then bump them into the full table for the requirements for that zoning category?
Yes.
So
hypothetically, and we're going to kind of use, say a property on Savannah Road wants to annex in. They want to use it as retail. Well, the AX Res doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
The AX Mix, maybe not, but it's like, oh, the general commercial, the GC makes more sense for that property. So maybe we come in and ask for that general commercial. Because again, when you're looking at an annexation, it's not just that particular use you're looking at what are the uses and zoning surrounding that property? What are the land uses surrounding that property? So you're taking that bigger picture. And that's, again, why I think some of those two new districts were created was because, okay, if we take our R4 or our R2, which have 5,000 and 10,000 square foot minimums, and we put them next to a county zoning classification, which allows for different sizes, does that fit quite right? Because what you don't want is, say, an industrial massive chicken plant or pickle plant or you name it, right next to 5,000 square foot lots for a residential use. You want to make sure, like, oh, in some cases, like, well, maybe that step down of commercial, because as you get closer towards the city, you've got more commercial, but you still got that residential, and that's a good kind of buffer between the uses for zoning wise. Or like if a property wants to come in as R4, or no, not R4, but like R2, they can make that application to come in as R2 for a zoning classification instead of the AX res or the AX mix. It just provides a different option. And I think the AX res also has a couple of different clustering options as well.
So actually, just to build on that, because I shared a question similar to what Nancy just asked in the meeting at 11 o'clock. I don't know why I have this, but I was under the distinct impression that AX res and AX mix were to be, those were the two choices that we were going to be applying on all annexation decisions down the line. And the explanation was given in the meeting at 11 o'clock actually made plenty of sense, and what you just said makes plenty of sense. So the question for me is, then what is the purpose of these? Is this just to help to reflect being a little more flexible in terms of the way we sort of offer a more flexible offering than the standard residential zoning districts or the standard commercial zoning district?
Well, that's interesting, because I went back to the comp plan, and the comp plan's purpose was sort of to make it more attractive to be a resident of Lewis than to be in the county, so to speak. So I think that's the purpose of the two zones that were created, was to something that would incentivize someone to come into the city rather than to stay out in the county.
Right.
I think
Absolutely. I mean, that's throughout a lot of the notes of the annexation ad hoc committee.
The question I have for Janelle is, the plan also talks about creating incentives such as tax abatements, fee reductions, or a streamline of the process. To your knowledge, have any of those been adopted?
I'm not aware of any of those items being adopted. I do know there is typically a cost for an annexation application, and sometimes it gets waived to help entice somebody to come in. The others, I am not aware of them being implemented. But I think what they did with the AX res and the AX mix was exactly what you said, Melanie. They provided some different incentives to entice people to come into the city.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the incentives seems to be density. And I don't know how that formula came about, you know, of taking the gross area of the property less tidal waters and wetlands, I think, and then dividing that by half an acre, basically.
That's actually from the county code.
That's from the county. That's interesting.
The county
And
code,
where does it apply?
it
Talking about
implies,
a yield formula, basically.
yeah. So in the county, and I believe they just amended this week, I believe. It used to apply in the old environmentally sensitive developing areas, which is now the coastal areas, for any subdivision going in there, that the way you did your calculation for your lots, for your density, was you would take out your wetlands and then you would divide it by 20,000 square feet or a half acre. And your lot size would
That's
come
the R1, the basic R1 size, AR1.
for a certain subdivision, yes. Yeah, for a cluster subdivision in the county, yes. So then, and it would allow you to go down to 7,500 square feet for a lot area. And again, the R2, which is typically what you would come in, is 10,000. So I think the intent was, how do we be a little bit more consistent with what you're seeing coming from the county and us going out? So how do we kind of match and do that? So looking at that calculation, that came from the county's regulations. It was very, or at least it's very similar.
I'm just kind of have a couple follow-up questions, because if you come in with a different zoning characteristic, some things like open space aren't even specified.
So typically in
first of all, is that correct?
So if you came in with general commercial, there's no open space requirement. It just that doesn't exist in that zoning classification. In a standard subdivision, it depends on the amount of open space. If you're coming with the AX res, the amount of open space increases significantly. Because typically what you'll see is like maybe 10%. And with the cluster optioning, I believe it goes up to 30% of required open space. And some even require 50% open space. So what they did is they reduced the lot size, changed a little bit of, I don't know if they changed the calculation of how density is calculated, because they actually took out certain things like wetlands, which actually reduces the amount of land you're going to start with to figure out your number of lots, and then said, okay, you can have that smaller lot size, but you're giving us more open space. But you can cluster those lots a little bit closer together.
So I may be jumping the gun here, but building on what Melanie was asking, I read it kind of the way Melanie did, that really the primary incentive, if you will, that these annex, particularly the AX res dimensional requirements offer is a density bonus. And yes, there are, it's a complicated table. And of course, I think we're going to have to roll up our sleeves on the relevant clustering ordinance. I think it's 140, what is it, 149-50, something like that.
Well, again, you're just looking at the AX res and the AX mixed districts. So I just want to keep us making sure that we can look back at other ones, but the only recommendations are regarding these two districts.
Okay, well, let's talk about this. Help me understand, is it 149-50? Do I have that right, the clustering option, the clustering ordinance?
I don't have it memorized off the top of my head.
Okay, well, because it's in your package. It's in the items that you list on the subcommittee website. It's in that city council conversation about annexation. And when you look at the
197-50.
197, sorry.
Yeah, I was like, the 140 didn't sound right.
Sorry. When you look, I've been working different things all morning.
It's okay.
When you look at the dimensional requirements for the AX res and the AX mix, particularly the AX res, there are whole columns that reference cluster option 1 and cluster option 2, which key on 179-50. So I don't know how we can do this job of one of the two districts without looking at the provisions of the clustering.
Right. And what I think that the cluster section, because it looks like it was amended right around the time of that. Sorry, I'm just reading the code.
Did it even exist before these districts?
I can't answer that. I honestly, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think it did. We have 3 members in the attendees. Maybe they know. But my understanding is it was part of the construction of the whole how to make it work in AX res.
If we're going to make changes to that, then I would make sure that if we're going to make changes to the AX res or the AX mix, that we would then go back and make sure if there's any other sections of code that need to be amended, we would do that.
Right.
That's part of my job, to make sure that we just don't end up with a conflict in code.
I totally agree with that. I mean, I think now, Nancy, I don't know what involvement you had. We did have, Melanie and I, and this is one of the first things that I did as a member of the Planning Commission, was to review the only project that's where AX res has been applied so far. And it was interesting to go through that process. I'm hoping that maybe Melanie can share her perspective. I may share my perspective at various points about how well I think it worked in practice. I'm hoping that we can craft something that's as good as it can be. That's the goal here.
I think this is an important discussion at this, at the outset of this subcommittee, and that is to really tie down kind of what are we looking at? What are the boundaries of it? And, before coming to this meeting, I listened to again the city council meeting and looked at what specifically they're asking us to do. And it is to send these zoning district ordinances to the Planning Commission for review and asking us to give any recommendations we may have to make. And when I read zoning district ordinances, the ordinance has all of these references to a whole series of things. And in a sense, the ordinance, in my mind, includes all of those call outs. And it's not just, it wouldn't just be, we're going to make a change and then we'll see if it makes a difference over here. I think we have to really look at those call outs as we're coming up with anything.
No.
Yeah,
I agree.
When I
So
listened
go ahead,
to,
Melanie.
sorry, when I listened to
Yeah,
the
I think
discussion that city council had,
Oh, we got two people talking.
sorry, I just wanted to finish one point. Yeah, when I listened to the discussion city council had, it was very clear that they were talking about, we were even asked to, look back and review the discussion and the issues. And I went back to look at the list of issues that were
It's a long
covered.
list.
And I think we need to decide, are we digging into each and every one of these? Is it the subset of them we want to look at? But I think that really then drives, but I wouldn't say it's just, an ordinance that doesn't link to anything, because the ordinance itself comprises all of those things. Sorry, Melanie.
Yeah, I found it, when I first started looking into this, I found it very confusing as to what the regulations were, because they seem to be all over the code in different places. So I think ultimately I would hope we would bring them all together in one place.
Yeah.
So that referencing, a chart here and a cluster option there, and was very discombobulating.
So the way my head is thinking is you focus on the AX res and the AX mix. And if you make any of those changes, then we go back and have to figure out what else in code it applies to. Because if you end up not changing that, then we don't have to change the other section of code. But if you end up changing something that actually, of course, then you change the other section of code, because you don't want that conflict in the code. You want the code to be the same thing.
Sorry, maybe it would help if, maybe Nancy and Melanie and I'll speak for myself. Maybe I'm being too literal about what it means to discuss the AX res and AX mix district. I think you and I had a conversation offline in preparation for this, and you mentioned 179-43.1 and 43.2 or something like that. The two literal descriptions of the zoning districts. They're only a handful of sentences. Are you suggesting that we start there and make sure that we've captured the intent? Because I completely agree with what Nancy said, that there are all these call outs that ultimately define what it means to be AX res and AX mix. I don't know how we can do anything but include those.
Mm-hmm. So what I think, and this is just my thought, is do we have any issues with the purposes of which is the really short statements of either of those? And then we can look at the table, because the table is really how the district works, what permitted uses are, how you calculate things. And then we look at that and then okay, do we want to make any changes to that? And then it's okay, if we're making changes to that, then we're going to have to make changes to the cluster section of the code. So I think you can look at it and again, if you're making changes to the table, understand you're at that same time making changes to the cluster section. But for a focusing perspective, because I'm guessing I'm the one who's going to be making the changes, I'm going to make changes to the table, and then I know I need to go fix the cluster section so then I can get it all back to you guys. But yeah, I think if we start with just the general, do we have any issues with what the districts mean and the purpose?
Well, I think on the purpose statement, if we're trying to entice people to annex and encourage them to be similar in character to the city of Lewis, then I think we should be more specific about that. And what I mean is street patterns, building orientation, character, all of these things that I think are essential to the character of Lewis. And one of the zoning tools that I think is often used is the traditional neighborhood design package. And I'd be happy to do a little presentation on that, perhaps at our next meeting. But what that does is really discuss the features of what makes a place a place. And it emphasizes the street patterns and the building orientations and the uses that are permitted and the setbacks and all of that kind of thing. So, when I think of Lewis and its character and what people really love, I think of Ship Carpenter Square, and I think of that as a traditional neighborhood design. It's got a little open space in the center of it. The houses are oriented to that, or they're oriented out to the street. And there's a little alley that serves them. Perfect, I think that embodies a lot of the character that at least I would like to see replicated around Lewis in the annexation zone.
Okay, somebody has their hand up in the attendees. If you could just put any questions into the chat, that would be helpful for us. I'd appreciate that. I think some of the stuff you're talking about, we can put that into the cluster design, but I think the whole purpose is, so I'm just going to read purpose of AXRES. The purpose of AXRES is to, 1, provide opportunities for residential development in areas not currently within existing city boundaries to be annexed into the city in accordance with the adopted comprehensive plan policies. 2, conserve open space, including those areas containing unique and sensitive natural resources, such as woodlands, streams, floodplains, and wetlands, by setting them aside from development, which I think gets back to some of your concerns, Melanie, because I think we also recognize farther out we go, we hit some environmental items that we want to contain. 3, provide development options for landowners which minimize impact on sensitive environmental resources, reduce disturbance of natural and cultural features, and conserve scenic views. And 4, provide a greater design flexibility and efficiency in the siting of services and infrastructure, including the opportunity to reduce the length of road, utilities, and the amount of paving and impervious surface required for residential development.
So just trying to make sense of how one might configure a site to balance out several of those items you just read off. And I don't know if it's worth just putting that up on the screen so everybody can see what you just read, but the last piece seems to me there's sort of a competing process between the last piece and the second to last piece, the one that deals with environmental stuff versus the flexibility. Because, and I believe Melanie will probably agree, when you start talking about clustering, as in some of the columns of the AXRES dimensional requirements, that in order, my understanding of clustering stems from the idea that we're going to offer flexibility in terms of reduced setback requirements and things like that, lot size requirements, in return for what I would call, these are my terms, a higher level of spatial discipline, sort of along the lines of what Melanie was talking about, but where you have, if you yielded out on an AR1 scale or whatever, or R2 scale or whatever you want, a certain number of lots that would fit equidistant from each other, perfectly exhausting the space of a parcel to be subdivided. If you took that, but you squeezed them into I don't know what it would be. It would depend on the dimensional requirements you work out. A third of the space, you would arrange them in such a way that they would do minimal damage to the environmental resources. They would maximize the utility of open space, and so on and so on. I see the density stuff going on, but I don't see what I call the spatial discipline piece of it going on.
Okay.
And I think we need to do some work there in order to make this work. That's just my first cut at AXRES. Melanie, I see you shaking your head. You would agree with that?
Yeah, I would agree that that's got to be an essential part of our reworking some of the code here.
And I have to say, I haven't really probably looked enough into this, but I don't know if it's better to sort of tackle one of these at a time. Is it better just to roll up our sleeves on AXRES and go through that, and then take the time to look at AX Mix? What do you guys think is the way to do this? I mean, you could lay out the AX Mix just the way you did just now. It might be helpful just to be able to read along, but again, I'm would still consider myself to be relatively new to the Planning Commission. And Nancy, I know you've got fewer hours than I do, but it's tough to take a set of words like you just read, Janelle, and turn that into a meaningful idea about how a site's to be developed or not be developed.
Okay, so again, that was just the purpose.
Yep.
I think the next thing we need to look at is the table, because I think it sounds like we have concerns about the way clustering works, and maybe some of those design standards for clustering. Nancy?
I hate to open this can of worms in a sense. And I haven't done enough comparisons to really say whether this is or isn't the case. But if I think back to the purposes, the 4 purposes that are objectives that you've just read, Janelle, and conserving open space and minimizing impacts on the environment, et cetera. I mean, it would appear to me that if I had a lot that had some environmentally sensitive spots in it, that it would be in my interest not to come in under AXRES if I was thinking about residential use, but instead to say I wanted it zoned, R4 or R, fill in the blank, because you don't, all of these requirements seem to come in only under the AXRES and the AX Mix.
So, and that's where the use table gets into play, because you can do different types of housing. In the R2, it's a single family house. That's the only thing you can do, single family. In the AXRES, you can do duplexes, which are the attached houses, or townhouses. So it gives you some different options.
Yeah, I understand that. And I mean, I think we have to think of this from multiple perspectives in terms of what's happening in the areas that potentially could be annexed. And I realize that the majority of it probably is about development, and developers would be most interested in the highest density that they can get because it gives the highest return. But if we're really talking about an objective to conserve open space and to minimize impacts on the environment, it just feels like there's a little bit of a loophole here around those issues, both in AXRES, both by picking a zoning category aside from AXRES or aside from AX Mix.
To build on that before you answer, Janelle, you mentioned that things had just changed with the coastal area district and the county. My sense is that the whole superior design conversation sort of factors into this as well.
Yes. So again, and some of that superior design has been put into the code and put into the table, because if you want that smaller lot size, say if you want those townhouses, your amount of open space just increased from, say, if I just want to do conventional AXRES lot I only have to do 10,000 square foot, 10,000% open space, 20,000 square foot lot. If I want to do a cluster option, single family, my open space just went from 10% to 30%. Now my lot size also came down. So keep that in mind. But then if I want to do cluster option 2, my lot size comes down a little bit more, but my open space just went to 50%. So there is some offset of the smaller the lot size, the more open space you're giving up to get those smaller sizes, which actually can get some, and you look at the traditional neighborhood design, it's not 20,000 square foot lots. It's not, you know, the big houses. It's sometimes the smaller, more compact, which is what you see in downtown Lewis. So if we just gave everybody, if we didn't allow for the clustering, and again, I'm not taking sides anyway, either way, it's just, but if we allow for the clustering, you can kind of get to more of what Melanie's talking about of, okay, you've got some central open space, or you're pushing or what you're doing is we recognize there's a pond in that property, or there's a bunch of trees that are like 50 to 100 years old. We want to protect those. So protect that area, push your houses away from that area to protect that natural resource or that environmental item that we recognize we want protection. And it also, sometimes you have to get, you know, sometimes you have to push the creativity with, you know, developers and engineers, because they're used to like, this is what we want. But it's also, you know, taking, you know, how do we just push them a little bit more to get them a little bit more creative.
So a question about that. Go ahead, Melanie.
We had a project that we approved in the AX, and it was very unpopular with the residents, very unpopular with the neighborhood. And yet it met everything in the code. I mean, there was nothing or very little that we could object to in terms of the layout. And I thought it showed virtually no creativity. And it really maxed out the development yield. And you know, there's nothing wrong with maxing, but on the other hand, we didn't get what was stated in the code right now, even though it met everything in the code. So we really do have to massage it somehow and make it so that we get what we want.
Right. And again, you're not always going to get what you want. Developers aren't always going to get what they want. Neighbors aren't always going to get what they want. I have been told from a planning perspective, if everybody's happy, I am not doing my job right. So somebody's you know, somebody's going to be unhappy. That means I'm doing my job because I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. And sometimes, yeah.
Well, I think that's why we've gotten this directive council, is that they didn't like hearing that either.
And again, we've only had one project use the zoning districts. So I think, you know, and again, we cannot discuss that application because it has not been finalized. So hypotheticals, you know, do we have any issues with the clustering options? Do we like that? Or are we okay with that, with like the increase in the open space, but maybe we need to tweak and put some other design standards into the cluster design section to get more of what we want? Or do we put more carrot going, okay, we'll give you this if you give us this, you know, like if you give us even more open space or do something else, then we'll reduce setbacks or something.
I think there's a lot of opportunity in there in just those two questions that I think you just asked. And I'm not sure that some of the things that I hope we we examine and hopefully put forth to the planning commission and back to council can fit neatly in something as simple as a table. I think it's going to have to get to the words and punctuation that relate to the table. And I just want to throw in, I couldn't find the planning commission, and I'm so glad you were able to find that, the 2018 planning commission minutes when they talked about it. One of the real challenges that I found looking back over the history of annexation was trying to dig earlier than 2019 when we changed our website, because everything before that time isn't really searchable in a meaningful way. I found myself looking through every page of every minute in planning and council, and that was incredibly difficult. I somehow missed that one meeting. But in that, I think it was in that meeting or in one of the other materials that you put on our little subcommittee page, Glenn Mandalis makes the point that somebody asked about negotiating with an applicant, and he made it pretty clear that's not our job in planning commission to be negotiating things. So whatever idea we want to have about how this works, it needs to be set in the code and the language in the districts, not waiting for the time that we're rolling up our sleeves on a given application.
So take what I said, it's like, you give me this, I'll give you that. You put that in the code. Like, okay, you want reduced setbacks. Well, if you give us, we'll put it in the table, reduce setbacks, but you have to do X, Y, and Z to get reduced setbacks. So that goes into the code. But you also have to remember, you don't want the code to be so prescriptive that if you get a unique site that has taken away all the ability to be somewhat creative. Now, again, historically, sometimes you don't always see the most creative, flexible designs, and sometimes they take advantage of what they can. But I try to meet with them and try to give them other ideas to start thinking. And I think it's also, you want to have, because sometimes some different properties, maybe they can sneak something in over here, but if you make it so prescriptive that something would be better over here, but they can't do it because of the way the code is written, you need some flexibility. What I'm saying is you need some flexibility in the code, because you don't want to be super prescriptive that you take everything out and then it's like, oh, well, this situation we didn't even think about. So you have to have some flexibility, because not every property is a square or a rectangle, and there might be different challenges based on different properties.
So I like that, but I guess the question is, how do you, this is where I wish I had, decades of actual planning experience like Melanie does. How do you allow the flexibility for that creativity, as you were just describing, on some particular special site, without sort of compromising too many other aspects of the general goal here, and maybe it's a matter of a different way of representing the goal, the criteria for success, than I guess what I'm used to seeing. And I'm thinking out loud here. I don't really know what that looks like, but in order to meet that flexibility and that creativity, while meeting what I think are the real challenges of being successful in well, I'm thinking more about AX-Res, because as Melanie said, we've had some experience with that. It comes down to the details about, in my mind, as to how you configure the open space, what's included in the calculation of open space, what kind of pattern is acceptable in open space. It's a number of things like that that are details beyond a simple percentage of the site in open space. And I think I'd like to see where we go with that.
I think we can tweak some of that in the cluster options. But since we've been talking for 46 minutes, I just want to get us an idea of, I think we're okay with the purpose of at least the AX-Res, environmentally sensitive, protect, try to make sure it's somewhat in keeping with the area. But it sounds like we need to take a look at those clustering options. Do those clustering options make sense? And then I think we need to dig deep and go, okay, get into, okay, well, you now have to give us 50% open space. How much of that has to be on one parcel of land? How much has it be connected? You know, so we don't get just that. And again, there are some requirements to have landscape buffers. So you will get some of that segmented with landscaping.
Connected, you mean like adjacency? Like where is the open space on the adjacent parcels?
No, that it's all like, so I've had
Within the parcel.
within the parcel that, you
Okay.
know, you've got 50% open space and it's not like half acre here, half acre here, half acre here, and it's all disconnected. And, you know, so much of it has to be one parcel of land, you know, because, and again, you
You're
have to
talking about
remember,
contiguity.
yes.
Okay.
I mean, I think that I think we need to have a plan for how we're going to attack this. And it probably is worthwhile for us to work with the four, you know, the four purposes. And if, as we're applying those, we see gaps or something that, you know, we really look at what we think the vision should be for how this would work, and somehow we see things happening that fit all of those, but don't fit what we really think should be the vision, then we can come back and we can revisit it. But I think it probably makes sense to start with those as a given that can be modified in the future, but a given. And then I do think we need to be looking at both, you know, remember we're asked to look at both AX Res and AX Mixed. And when I went through all of the minutes, it seemed like there was a much greater emphasis on AX Res in the past.
That
And
was
I
my
think there's
impression
a
as well.
tendency to be based on, you know, what applications have come forward recently, and they've tended to be more residential, to focus on that. And then you get caught kind of with your pants down because you weren't thinking of the mixed portion of this as much as maybe we should have. So I think we have to do both. I'm wondering if it wouldn't make sense for us as a committee to each take and you know, when I'm looking at the issues, density, open space, and cluster seem to be pretty high to the top of the list of discussions. You know, and we can still come to things like landscaping. You know, I'm looking at the list that they looked at when they were going through this. You know, trees, building height, you know, those things. But somehow, if we would focus first on density, open space, and maybe buffers and cluster, and each took one of those and looked through the table against, you know, looking at that against the objectives. And so in our next meeting, we each could come back with either a list of questions or a list of areas for discussion, et cetera. I just think we need to have a place where we start and a way to structure this. And Melanie, I don't know, I mean, you've mentioned a presentation that you think would be helpful. I'd be very interested in hearing that.
Okay.
And I don't know
I
the
agree with
timing
that.
of when that would make the most sense. So.
So Nancy, I really like your suggestion. I guess maybe it's just the way I operate. I imagine that as we roll up our sleeves and get into some of the details, we will ultimately come back with some need to possibly modify the language of the purposes.
Yeah.
But as an exercise, as a way to dig in and really evaluate things, I think it's a great way to go. As far as the way you suggest doing that, where we each go off and take a piece of the pie, I'm kind of at a loss as whether that's the best way to go, but I mean, that's fine. I think however we slice it, we're all gonna bump into each other along the way.
Mm-hmm.
So you know, I
Yeah.
think as long as we can have
So-
an open way of conversing, I think it'll work out well.
I mean, I think we could equally well structure some, a meeting focusing on first on clusters or first on this and that. And it obviously everything, I mean, it's an ecosystem, right?
Yes, it is.
Everything connects. But I just feel like we need, if we just sit down with the table and start looking at like the whole thing, I'm afraid we won't be capturing the feedback, the changes, and identifying, the areas in the purposes that maybe need to be tweaked.
So keeping in mind something that Melanie said a while ago that I think preceded her description of Ship Carpenter Square as some sort of an idealized Lewis pattern. I think whenever we look at this stuff, we have to think about what is it that because this is clearly what I've heard in all the meetings where I've been on the other side of the table as a member of the Planning Commission. The neighbors have an idea about what they expect Lewis to be and what they hope it won't be. And so I hope that's something in the back of our minds as we're doing all of this. How we clearly describe that to everybody who might read the ordinance, I don't know. But Janelle, can you put the AX-RES, can you go to the code where the stuff you just read is? Seems to me we could start with picking the phrases or elements that are called out in that purpose as a way of breaking up the workload here. Does that sound agreeable to you, Nancy? Does that sound like what you were getting at? Or are you saying just go right to the issues that the three of us have popped up so far: clustering, open space?
So you're saying we each take one of the four purposes?
Okay.
And think of that. Is that what you're saying?
No, that's not what. Okay, so
I'm
sorry,
wondering if
I didn't completely understand what you were proposing. So if you could.
Sorry, I'm not proposing. I'm asking. What I'm I don't want to ignore the fact that JH, who I'm assuming is Joe Hockner, I don't know.
yes.
Is out there with a question in the chat, which.
Yeah, he just said you have to stop thinking about only developers. You have to start think about property owners too. And I think we all have to do that. I also have to remind everybody has a different vision of what Lewis is and what Lewis looks like.
Mm-hmm.
So there are 4 different visions of what Lewis should look like right here.
That's why I asked the question about the
out there. So it's, again, about you can't be so prescriptive that you're taking away somebody else's idea of what Lewis is.
But in fact, there is a shared description, and that's the I think it's called the value statement. You know what I'm referring to?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, the city has values.
Busy days, quiet evenings,
Yes.
all of those things. And I mean, I think that we should take as something that gives a sense of what we expect from our community.
Right. So the question I had basically was, we can either take a couple of the issues that we've already identified or things that are of concern to us, or we take each of the elements of the purpose of, say, AX-RES, and we each go off with that purpose and look through the relevant code, particularly the clustering code, to come up with questions for discussion. I'm asking, those are 2 slightly different ways of going. I'm more in the latter category. Start with that purpose statement and take whatever piece of the purpose you want and go forth and examine the relevant code with that in mind, particularly the clustering. I guess it's 17950 and the tabular elements that apply. Does that sound reasonable? Melanie?
Well, I think I sort of like Nancy's approach, but I think what you're doing is you're saying take purpose statement and apply it to each of the 3 things that Nancy outlined. And I think that's a good way to approach it.
So maybe I just didn't, I'm sorry. What were the 3 things that Nancy, that you said?
Density,
you said clustering?
open space, yeah, density, open space, and cluster.
All right, and of course they all interact, but yeah.
And then how do they relate back to the purpose statements is what I
Okay,
think
that's
Nancy was
fine.
saying.
Yeah, I
Is
just
if
want
we
to get
look
back.
at, if we look at, you know, the cluster optioning one with how it relates to calculating of density, the sizes, the amount of open space, and then how does it connect back to the purpose?
Mhm.
Cluster optioning two, all those same criteria, and how does it reflect back to the purpose? Did I get that right?
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm copacetic with doing it with any way that we have some structure for
Yeah.
what, you know, what we're doing. And
Yeah.
my hunch is we're going to end up at the same place, no matter which angle we come at it from, you know, in terms of the same place, in terms of really digging into what the issues are.
No, I totally agree. Having spent some time now on this sea level rise subcommittee, and you guys are all on other committees as well, I think one thing that we should establish right from the get-go is we're going to run up against things that may not necessarily fit neatly in this annexation discussion. I want to make sure and capture them, because
Mhm.
I got to say, one of the things that I'm finding as I've reviewed this stuff and thought about it is it picks up on something that Nancy said a while ago about if I were the owner of a property and I looked at this AX code, in some ways, it'd be easier for me to go forth in one of the regular residential districts rather than all the further language and possible constraints that are brought on by electing to be an AX res or AX mix. I mean, maybe I didn't misunderstood you, but basically
Mhm.
we've gone a little farther in terms of trying to put things together in this AX implementation than I think we have in, and correct me if I'm wrong, in the standard vanilla flavors residential and commercial districts. And I think I could imagine that as we go through this, we may find opportunities to make recommendations about revisions to the major subdivision, pieces of the major subdivision code. I don't know. It's just something that I imagine. I just want to capture those things as we're moving through processing of this process of these interconnected pieces. Like you said, Nancy, it's an ecosystem. So, Melanie, you were trying to say something and I spoke too much.
Yeah, I really appreciate Janelle's comment about being too prescriptive. And one of the suggestions that I would proffer is that some communities that I've worked in create what's called a pattern book. So it's sort of a collection of what you want to see in pictures rather than prescriptive language. Now, this is the result we want. And
Yeah,
that
like,
it's not in the code, but it's referenced perhaps in the code, and it's something that Janelle can hand out to a potential developer and say, this is what we really want to see in the AX. So
yeah,
that's another suggestion.
I've worked with those too, and it's like you pick and choose what makes sense. Because like, again, not
Yeah.
everything's gonna like, oh, I want this. Well, that doesn't work here, but this could.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I think that can come down. I think the first thing it sounds like, go through the cluster options, see what makes sense based on the density, the open space, and then does it work towards the purpose? And I think if we can get through that, then we can kind of go like, oh, what are some items that, like, for a pattern book or different items that we can put into that cluster section that help us even further get to the purpose. Does that make sense?
In our vision. I mean, I have to agree with the idea of having a pattern book or something like that. I mean, I think to be able to provide some visual background context for all the words that are in this city code, I think would go a long way. And I've been looking around, banging around some of this pattern stuff as well, some of the the new urbanist type stuff. And my sense is, and correct me if I'm wrong, Melanie or Janelle, those pattern choices, as you refer to them, they're different ways of implementing some of the kinds of numbers that are in our table. there, for a given situation, we would like to see setbacks of this type. We'd like to see buildings that are closer to the front of a lot rather than square in the middle of a lot. We want this kind of massing on the sides of the buildings or whatever. There's a lot of architectural stuff in there too. And I realize that may be beyond our planning commission realm, but I think the more we can get at some of this visual stuff and provide options, I think the better this may work out. As long as all that stuff fits back together with the purpose and what we, I guess, are going to have to interpret how all those city values, that value system, the quiet nights and internal communities and the other pieces of that value statement. I'm assuming that's the basic check we've got to apply. Are we still being true to those value statements?
Right, and also remember, you have to also balance what you're meeting up against, because you've got the core Lewis, but then as we grow out, we're meeting with the county. So maybe core Lewis exactly does not match adjacent to the county. So what hybrid makes sense there? And I think that's also what this is trying to do as well, because you can't go from like more of a rural setting with larger lots to much smaller, very compact. It's finding that balance that works in between while still maintaining that character and feel of Lewis. So also something to keep it in mind. But it sounds like we've got some homework.
Can I just offer an observation before you move into that?
Sure.
Just based on what you just said, when I went through a while back looking at all the different zoning districts, I think it's either R1 or R2. Actually, the language of the purpose of that district is to provide a district for annexation. And it was interesting to me to see that it preceded all this AX res AX mix stuff. And what I'm wondering out loud here to everybody on the call here is, when that was written, perhaps there was a lot more open rural agricultural and so on area out on the edge of town, out in the county. And since that's been developed, of course, the county's been marching our way. So that there's less and less of that landscape. And in fact, the context for any decision along our boundary may very well be a denser, more urban pattern, if you will. So yeah, I get that.
I also think one of those was the properties had developed in the county and then annexed into the city and didn't fit into one of the existing zoning districts.
Okay.
So how do we make something that's already existing less non-conforming with the city setbacks? Because I think that, from my understanding, that happened as well. You get these lots with different setbacks and you come into the city and the setbacks are all different. So how did that kind of meld? So I think they looked at that too. But I think what we're looking at is blank land, clean slate for development.
Okay, so I interrupted you. You were about ready to give us a charge.
Yes, homework, if we're good, if we're ready for homework. It sounds like we're gonna look at the table, the cluster options, look at, do those lot sizes, which goes back to density, does that density calculation make sense? Does that open space calculation make sense to the amount of open space? And those other criteria that we see in the purpose. So based on the tables, is that information making sense with our purpose? And then again, the density calculation is in 197.50. So does that make sense with back to our purpose?
Sorry, Melanie.
Sorry.
Fourth thing.
Having trouble hearing you.
Open space is its own issue, I think.
Yes. Yeah, the density to the open space. Do those make sense?
Cluster density and open space, right? Cluster density and open space we're focusing on first.
Yes.
Okay.
So look at the tables for the option 1, option 2. Like, do those make sense with our purpose?
So getting back to Nancy's original suggestion, are we each going to take one of these 3 terms and run it through this process, or are all three of us going to keep them all? I mean, I see so much in a relationship between these. I'm struggling a little bit with how we break this up.
I think just to me is so everybody takes it. So you're looking at, and again, you're just looking at cluster option 1 and 2 with the density calculation, the open space requirements, the lot sizes, all that, and then looking back at how do they relate to our purpose, and do we need to make any changes to the calculation or that table, discuss that, and it's like, okay, then what changes then do we need to make to the cluster ordinance section? Do we need to add some more requirements for maybe a pattern book, or requirements regarding open space, or different changes? So what do you guys think about that?
I'm fine with sort of keeping these three concepts of density, cluster, and open space in mind, going through particularly the clustering ordinance 17950, and using those three terms as a way of sort of evaluating what's in there. But I don't want to unnecessarily burden either of the other two. What do you all think? Would you rather just take one, Nancy takes density, or Melanie takes density, whatever? I mean, how do you guys want to do this?
From my perspective, if you're all working on the same thing, then I can kind of take it, collate it,
Okay.
look at it, and then get it back to you guys, because you guys might be on the same page.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
I can go, okay, we've got differences here and here. Somebody's in the middle. What do you guys think? But that's just my brain working. It's like however you guys want to get me back the data so I can get it back to you guys.
That sounds good to me. Melanie, what do you think?
Well, I like the idea of each taking one, but I'm flexible.
Well, why, I mean, a compromise is we each take one, but you're free to look at them all and send what you find because I'll go deeper if I have one probably than if I have all three.
Then let's do that. Which one would you like?
I'll do open space.
Melanie?
Okay, I'll take cluster.
All right. That leaves me with density. Okay.
Okay. So when do you guys want to meet next? Because that way I can give you a deadline for your homework.
When's the
Is
next
there-
sea level rise meeting? Next week? It's right before
Yeah,
the
we
planning
won't be
commission
able to
meeting.
meet next week, just
Yeah,
FYI.
so at least 2 weeks from now. I mean, yeah. How long you all think it'll take? I mean, we could probably get a first crack at this done in 2 weeks. Is that good?
Or do you want to
Do we
meet
need-
the week of the 22nd?
If we're doing it on a Thursday at 1 p.m., I have another board meeting then, so I can't do the 25th. I can do.
No, I mean, you guys can pick a day or a time. This
Well,
just,
what about the 24th?
Sounds good.
what time?
11?
Actually, I am not good that day. I apologize. I'm taking a floodplain training, flood management training that.
Oh, that's great. I'm
The
glad to hear that.
22nd or the 26th that week. Or we could do like the 16th.
22nd looks good.
22nd's fine with me. What time works for you guys?
Is that a Tuesday?
It is a Tuesday. No, it's a Monday.
Oh,
Monday.
Monday.
Monday's fine.
I'm good any time of the day, so whatever y'all want.
Let
Do
me see
11?
what's 11. And if I
11?
have to move it, I will let you guys know.
All right.
Okay,
And then if
1
you could-
o'clock is good too,
I'm sorry?
or 1 o'clock would be an alternative.
Okay.
And when do you need stuff from us?
Right.
I would say by the 16th. That gives me a couple days to kind of go through it gives you guys almost a week and a half to get comments. And then if you can get it back to me on the 16th, which is a Tuesday, that way then I have a couple of days to get things back to you guys.
Okay,
Okay.
super. We're gonna
Okay.
knock this out in no time, right?
Yep.
Absolutely.
I'm actually looking forward to this. I think at first I was feeling rather burdened by the huge history that precedes us. But to jump into these particular topics, I think we're going to touch everything else we need to. And it's going to give us a chance to really chew on some things and work it out. I'm looking forward to this.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm really excited about this group. So Janelle, thank you. So we will just send our stuff to you by the 16th.
Yes, please. And if you have
Thank you,
questions in the meantime, you know where to find me.
All right.
Okay,
Thank you, guys.
All right, everybody have a
Okay,
good
bye now.
afternoon.
You too.
you too.